There's a kind of darkness that festers in quiet places. It hides under the cheerful veneer of small-town life, behind the manicured lawns and the Friday night football games. Hawkins, Indiana, in the fall of 1983, was one of those places. A town so aggressively normal it felt like a stage set, just waiting for the curtain to rise on a nightmare. This is the story of that curtain rising, of a week where the town's wholesome facade was ripped away to reveal a world of secret labs, psychic children, and monsters that lurked in a shadowy reflection of our own world. Before the night of November 6, 1983, Hawkins was a town suspended in the amber of routine. It operated on a rhythm of school bells, factory whistles, and the comforting static of television sets. To understand the storm, you have to first understand the quiet world it shattered. At the very heart of this world, in the sacred wood-paneled basement of the Wheeler house, was a fellowship. Mike Wheeler, Lucas Sinclair, Dustin Henderson, and Will Byers weren't just friends. They were a party, their bond forged in the crucible of 10-hour Dungeons & Dragons campaigns. Mike was their dungeon master, the storyteller, the leader whose passion for the game gave their world its shape and rules. He was the heart of the group, driven by a fierce loyalty that often bordered on idealism. Lucas was the pragmatist, the ranger, his mind always focused on logic and strategy, his skepticism a necessary counterbalance to Mike's impulsiveness. Dustin was the diplomat, the bard, his infectious curiosity and scientific mind a bridge between Mike's heart and Lucas's logic, his humor the glue that held them together. And then there was Will the wise, their cleric. He was the quietest of the group, a gentle soul with a powerful imagination, an artist who filled notebooks with drawings of fantastical creatures. His home life was fractured, caught between a loving but perpetually stressed single mother and an absentee father who was more of a ghost than a parent. The party's basement was his true sanctuary, a place where he wasn't the poor kid with the troubled family, but a powerful magic user, a vital part of a team. Their lives revolved around school, the arcade, and the epic tales they wove together with dice and miniatures. Their greatest enemy was the Thessal Hydra, a monster confined to the pages of a manual, a beast they could defeat with strategy and teamwork before riding their bikes home for dinner. They were innocent, their world defined by the clear, simple morality of a fantasy game. On one side of town, in that same fragile ecosystem, was the Byers family, hanging on by a thread. Joyce Byers was a force of nature, a lioness of a mother who worked long, thankless hours at a downtown general store to keep her two sons clothed and fed. She was a woman of fierce, almost frantic love, her life a constant battle against financial insecurity and the quiet judgment of a town that looked down on her messy, unconventional family. Her oldest son, Jonathan, was an island of quiet observation. He was an outsider by choice and by circumstance, finding solace not in people, but in the lens of his camera and the rebellious catharsis of punk rock music. He was the silent guardian of his family, his camera a shield between himself and a world he felt he didn't belong to, his love for his mother and brother a quiet, intense fire that burned beneath his withdrawn exterior. He watched the world but he wasn't a part of it. Then there was the teenage strata of Hawkins High, a world of social hierarchies as rigid as any caste system. Nancy Wheeler, Mike's older sister, was a girl caught between two worlds. She was intelligent, ambitious, a model student with a clear vision for her future, a future that did not involve staying in Hawkins. But she was also drawn into the orbit of Steve Harrington, the king of the school, a boy whose charm and effortless popularity were an intoxicating escape from the predictability of her own life. Their budding romance was pulling her away from her best friend, the equally smart but far more grounded and cynical Barbara Holland. Barb was Nancy's anchor to her old self, the voice of caution that was being increasingly ignored in favor of late-night study sessions that were really just excuses to be with Steve. And at the top of the adult food chain, there was Chief Jim Hopper. He was a man who had actively chosen to rust. Once a sharp big city detective, he had retreated to the comfortable obscurity of his hometown after the tragic death of his young daughter, Sarah. Grief had hollowed him out, leaving behind a cynical, hungover shell of a man. He lived in a rundown trailer, his life a numbing cycle of coffee, contemplation, and alcohol. He was the town's highest authority, but he had no authority over his own pain. He performed his duties with a practiced apathy, his job a meaningless distraction from the ghosts that haunted his every waking moment. This was Hawkins before the fall, a town of quiet lives and secret heartaches, a perfectly normal place, utterly oblivious to the storm that was gathering just beneath its feet in the cold, sterile, and silent depths of the National Laboratory that loomed on its outskirts. The night the world broke began with the roll of a die. In Mike Wheeler's basement, the party was locked in a life-or-death battle against the Demogorgon, a monster of myth and paper. Will Byers, facing a critical choice, cast a fireball, but the monster got him. It was a game, a moment of fictional tragedy that served as a chilling overture to the real horror that was about to unfold. As the boys packed up their bikes and rode off into the cool November night, their conversation filled with the cheerful autopsy of their campaign. A very different kind of drama was reaching its own terrifying climax deep inside the concrete fortress of Hawkins National Laboratory. There, a small, terrified girl with a shaved head and a tattoo of the number unwind on her wrist was floating in a sensory deprivation tank. Under the cold, watchful eye of Dr. Martin Brenner, the man she called Papa, 11 was being forced to push her immense psychic abilities to their absolute limit. Her mission was to make contact with a creature Brenner had detected, a whisper from another dimension. She had made contact before, a terrifying glimpse of a faceless monster in the black, watery void of her mind. Now, Brenner, in his boundless, reckless ambition, wanted her to do it again. The psychic strain was immense. As she reached out with her consciousness, the lights in the lab flickered violently. The concrete walls of the chamber began to crack. She touched the monster's mind, and for a horrifying, eternal second, a bridge was formed between their worlds. The creature's raw, predatory hunger flooded her senses, and the resulting psychic explosion of pure terror was more powerful than anything she had ever produced. It tore a hole in the fabric of reality. A glistening, pulsating wound opened in the wall of the chamber, a gate. From its fleshy, bleeding maw, the Demogorgon, drawn by the psychic siren's call, stepped into our world. The lab was plunged into chaos. Alarms blared. Scientists screamed, their lives extinguished in a whirlwind of claws and teeth. In the pandemonium, 11, small and terrified, saw her chance. She slipped away, escaping the sterile prison that was the only home she had ever known, and ran into the cold, rainy woods of Hawkins. She was a ghost in a hospital gown, a weapon that had catastrophically misfired, a child escaping one nightmare only to run headfirst into another. Meanwhile, Will Byers was on his final, lonely ride home. The path took him down a dark, deserted road that bordered the woods surrounding the lab. He heard a noise, saw a figure in the road, tall, slender, monstrous. Panic seized him. He crashed his bike and ran, a desperate, frantic sprint through the woods towards the safety of his home. He burst through the front door, fumbling with the lock on the back shed, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. He loaded a shotgun, his small hands trembling, and aimed it at the door. The shed was illuminated by a single, bare bulb, which began to flicker, brightening and dimming with an unnatural rhythm. And then the monster was there. It was not in front of him, but behind him. It was everywhere at once. And with a final, terrifying flicker, the light bulb went out, and Will Byers vanished from the face of the earth. Back at the Byers house, Joyce awoke with a start, a mother's instinct telling her something was wrong. She found the front door ajar, the dog barking at nothing, and her youngest son's bed empty. The first seeds of a panic that would consume her had been planted. The catalyst was not one event, but two, a terrible twin birth of chaos. A monster had been unleashed, and a child had been taken. The normal world of Hawkins was over. The game had just become real. The disappearance of Will Byers sent a tremor through Hawkins, but it was the boys of the party who felt it as an earthquake. For them, it wasn't just a news story, it was a personal wound, a missing piece of their fellowship. While the adults, led by a skeptical Chief Hopper, began the slow, procedural work of a standard missing person case, Mike, Lucas, and Dustin knew they couldn't just wait. Their friend was in danger, and their D&D honed sense of duty compelled them to act. Their quest began the next day, a solemn procession on bicycles into the darkening woods of Mirkwood, the last place Will's bike had been seen. Armed with binoculars, snacks, and the unwavering belief that they could succeed where the adults would fail, they set out to find their lost friend. The woods, usually a place of adventure and make-believe, felt different that night. A storm was rolling in, the wind whispering through the trees, turning familiar shadows into menacing shapes. It was in this eerie, charged atmosphere that they stumbled upon something far stranger than a lost boy. A small, shivering figure, her head shaved, wearing a dirty, oversized t-shirt, stumbled into the beams of their flashlights. She was mute, terrified, and looked as if she had escaped from a nightmare. This was their first encounter with 11. The reaction within the party was a perfect reflection of their core personalities. Lucas, the pragmatist, was immediately suspicious. His internal alarm bells were screaming. A strange, silent girl appearing in the exact woods where their friend vanished. It was too much of a coincidence. He saw her as a threat, a weirdo, who was likely connected to what happened to Will, and not in a good way. Dustin, the mediator and resident curiosity engine was a mix of caution and utter fascination. He understood Lucas's logic, but he was too intrigued by this human anomaly to dismiss her. He saw a mystery to be solved, a puzzle that might just be the key to their larger quest. But it was Mike, the heart of the party, who felt an immediate and overwhelming wave of empathy. He saw not a threat or a puzzle, but a person who was as lost and scared as they were. In a moment of decisive leadership that would alter all of their fates, he chose compassion over suspicion. He made the dungeon master's call. They would help her. Smuggling her into his house under the cover of the storm, he brought her down into the sanctuary of his basement. For 11, who had only known the cold, sterile white of the lab, the Wheelers' basement was a different universe. It was a chaotic, colorful wonderland of comic books, fantasy posters, and the comforting clutter of a happy childhood. It was the first safe place she had ever known. Mike, with a gentle patience that stood in stark contrast to the cold commands of Dr. Brenner, offered her dry clothes and food. He discovered her love for Eggo waffles, a small detail of normalcy in her extraordinary existence. He tried to communicate with her, to learn her name. In response, she showed him the only name she had ever been given, pulling up the sleeve of her t-shirt to reveal the stark black ink of the number 011 tattooed on her wrist. The formation of this new faction, the party plus their new super-powered member, immediately created a fault line in their friendship. Mike's basement became a secret-keeping bunker, the mission to find Will now complicated by the new, equally important mission of protecting 11. Lucas's suspicion festered, leading to heated arguments with Mike. He didn't trust her. Why wouldn't she talk about where she came from? Why were bad men looking for her? He was convinced she was a trap, a dangerous distraction that was leading them away from Will. Mike, whose protective feelings for 11 were growing by the hour, defended her fiercely. Dustin was caught in the middle, trying to keep the peace while being secretly blown away by the strange things that happened around 11. The first time she used her powers in front of them, telekinetically slamming a door to stop Lucas from revealing her to Mike's mom, Dustin's face was a perfect picture of awe and terror. This wasn't a game anymore. This was real magic, and this strange, silent girl was at the center of it all. She was no longer just a weirdo they had found in the woods. She was their secret, their weapon, and their only hope. The fragile alliance in Mike Wheeler's basement was a powder keg of childhood loyalty, suspicion, and a power none of them could comprehend. The conflict was no longer just about finding Will. It was about understanding the strange, silent girl who seemed to be the key to the entire mystery. The first major test of this new faction came not from a monster, but from a school bully. And it was a confrontation that would forever cement 11's place in their party. The boys, led by 11, who had recognized Will in a photograph, had a new theory. Will wasn't just lost, he was hiding from something. Using their Dungeons & Dragons board as a visual aid, 11 provided the first real clue to his whereabouts. She took the wizard miniature representing Will and placed it on the board. Then she took the terrifying, two-headed Demogorgon figure. With a solemn look, she flipped the entire game board over to its black, featureless underside. Placing Will's piece there with the monster looming over it. "Hiding," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was a stunning revelation. Will wasn't in their world. He was trapped in a dark, inverted reflection of it, a place she implicitly understood, the Upside Down. This confirmation that she knew something vital about Will was a turning point. But it didn't quell Lucas's fears. He saw her knowledge as proof of her complicity, not her innocence. This internal conflict reached its peak at Sattler's quarry. The party was paying their respects at the place where Will's bike was found when they were confronted by Troy and James, the school's resident sociopaths. The confrontation escalated quickly, Troy pulling a knife and threatening to cut out Dustin's teeth unless Mike performed a suicidal jump from the high cliff into the water below. Mike, in a selfless act of courage to save his friend, agreed. As he stood on the precipice, his friend screaming for him to stop, he jumped. But he didn't hit the water. He stopped in midair, suspended by an unseen force, and was then gently levitated back to the top of the cliff. The party looked on in stunned silence as Eleven emerged from the woods, her hand outstretched, blood trickling from her nose. Her face was a mask of cold fury. She turned her attention to the bullies, and with a flick of her wrist, she broke Troy's arm with a sickening crack. The bullies fled, screaming in terror. It was a terrifying, awesome display of power. For Mike and Dustin, it was confirmation that she was not a monster, but a superhero. For Lucas, it was confirmation that she was a monster, a weapon too dangerous to be trusted. The aftermath of the quarry incident was a schism. Lucas, now more convinced than ever that she was a danger to them all, left the group, determined to find Will on his own terms. The party was broken. Meanwhile, a different kind of conflict was playing out across town. Joyce Byers, convinced she was communicating with Will through the lights in her house, was descending into what everyone else saw as madness. She bought every string of Christmas lights in town, creating a chaotic, colorful communication board on her living room wall. She was fighting a battle against consensus reality, her maternal instinct, her only guide. Chief Hopper, for his part, was fighting his own battle against his ingrained cynicism. His investigation into the lab had raised too many red flags. His discovery of a torn piece of a hospital gown near a lab drainage pipe was a tangible clue that connected all the strange dots. He was beginning to believe that the key to Will's disappearance lay behind the lab's fortified walls. The first conflicts had been fought. The party was fractured. Joyce was isolated in her grief, and Hopper was on a collision course with a powerful and shadowy enemy. The stakes had been defined not in a game, but in real, terrifying violence, and the true cost of this new reality was only just beginning to be understood. The days following Will's disappearance were a lost era for the residents of Hawkins, a period where the fabric of their normal lives was stretched thin, revealing the grief and fear underneath. For Joyce Byers, this was a time of profound isolation. Her desperate attempts to communicate with her son through the flickering Christmas lights in her home had branded her as the town's resident lunatic. Her frantic energy, her wild-eyed insistence that Will was alive and speaking to her from the walls, was met with pity and condescension. Even her own son Jonathan struggled to believe her, his pragmatic nature clashing with his mother's seemingly impossible claims. She was a woman drowning in a truth no one else could see, her sanity fraying with each coded flicker from the upside down. Her home, once a messy but loving sanctuary, became her war room, the walls covered in painted letters, the air thick with the smell of old coffee and desperate hope. She was a general with an army of one, fighting a battle for her son's soul against an enemy she couldn't see or name. Her trauma was not just the loss of her son, but the gaslighting she endured from an entire town that saw her grief as madness. Across town, Nancy Wheeler was entering her own lost era, one defined by a creeping, gnawing guilt. Her best friend, Barbara Holland, had vanished from Steve Harrington's backyard during a party Nancy never should have been at. While Nancy was upstairs with Steve, losing her virginity and stepping further into his world of popularity, Barb was outside, alone, a perfect target for the creature that had been drawn by the scent of blood. Barb's disappearance was initially overshadowed by the town-wide panic over Will Byers. Her parents were told she probably ran away, a plausible story for a sensible girl who was likely tired of her friend's new social climbing antics. But Nancy knew better. She remembered Barb's car still parked outside Steve's house. She remembered the strange, shadowy figure she had glimpsed in the woods. A deep sense of responsibility began to eat away at her. She had abandoned her friend for a boy, and now Barb was gone. This guilt began to create a chasm between her and Steve. He couldn't understand her obsession, her growing anxiety. He represented the world of carefree normalcy she had been so desperate to join, but that world now felt hollow and false. The rebuilding of Nancy's purpose began here in the ashes of her guilt. The studious, rule-following girl began to transform into a determined investigator, her quest to find Barb leading her down a path that would intersect with Hawkins' darkest secrets. Chief Jim Hopper was also in a period of rebuilding, though his was a reconstruction of a purpose he had long since abandoned. The cynical, apathetic cop was being slowly but surely replaced by the shrewd, relentless detective he used to be. The Byers case had gotten under his skin, awakening instincts he had tried to drown in alcohol for years. He began his own clandestine investigation into Hawkins' lab, treating it not as a government facility, but as a potential crime scene. He started by digging into the past, pulling on the threads of old newspaper articles and public records. This led him to the story of Terry Ives, a woman who had participated in Brenner's MK-Ultra experiments in the 1960s and had later sued the lab, claiming they had stolen her infant daughter, Jane. The official story was that Ives was mentally unstable, that she had miscarried. But Hopper, now viewing everything through a lens of deep suspicion, saw a pattern. A missing child, a grieving mother, a wall of official denial. It was all too familiar. He drove out to see Terry, but found her in a catatonic state, cared for by her sister, a ghost trapped in a waking nightmare, endlessly repeating a string of cryptic words. The visit was a dead end, but it confirmed for Hopper that the lab had a history of secrets, of broken lives, and stolen children. He was no longer just searching for Will Byers. He was uncovering a decades-long conspiracy, a history of abuse and experimentation that had culminated in the current crisis. The Lost Era was a time of deep psychological exploration for these key characters. Joyce was lost in her singular truth. Nancy was lost in her guilt, and Hopper was finding the man he had lost so long ago. They were all isolated in their individual struggles, unaware that their separate paths were all converging on the same monstrous truth. The reemergence of the threat in a tangible, undeniable form came through the lens of a camera. The new idea that the monster was real, that it could be seen and even fought, was born from an unlikely alliance between two of Hawkins' resident outsiders, Nancy Wheeler and Jonathan Byers. Nancy, consumed by guilt and frustration over the lack of progress in Barb's case, noticed something in one of Jonathan's photographs. He had been in the woods near Steve's house the night of the party, a creeper taking pictures from the shadows. In one of the photos, a candid shot of Barb sitting alone by the pool, a dark, indistinct figure lurked in the background. It was blurry, almost lost in the gloom, but it was there. A tall, slender shape with no face. It was the first piece of physical evidence that what was happening in Hawkins was not just a series of disappearances, but the work of a predator. This discovery forged a new faction. Nancy and Jonathan, two people who had previously occupied completely different social orbits, were now bound together by a shared purpose. She was the driven investigator, and he, the reluctant witness. They took the photograph to be developed and enhanced, the image becoming clearer, more defined, more monstrous. The creature was real. Their search for answers led them back to the woods, to the last place Barb was seen. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of dread, the familiar landscape now feeling alien and hostile. It was there that they found a wounded deer, its leg caught in a trap, crying out in pain. As they watched, the deer was suddenly dragged away into the darkness by an unseen force, a trail of blood marking its path. They followed the trail, their fear warring with their determination, and it led them to a grotesque sight, a pulsating, fleshy hole in the base of a tree. It looked like a wound in the world itself, a gateway to somewhere else. This was the moment Nancy made a fateful decision. Driven by a desperate need to find her friend, she crawled into the opening. The world she emerged into was a nightmare. She was in the Upside Down. It was a dark, decaying echo of her own world, the air thick with floating, snow-like spores, the ground covered in pulsing, vine-like tendrils. It was a world that was both dead and terrifyingly alive. She saw the monster, the Demogorgon, feasting on the carcass of the deer, its faceless head peeling open to reveal its horrifying, flower-like mouth of teeth. She saw it, and it saw her. Her scream was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the Upside Down. Back in the real world, Jonathan heard her screams and frantically tried to pull her back through the portal. He managed to grab her hand just as the Demogorgon lunged for her, pulling her back into the safety of their own dimension, the portal sealing behind them. The experience was transformative. Nancy was no longer just a guilty friend. She was a survivor, a witness. She had seen the other side. She had seen the monster, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that it was what had taken Barb and Will. The sensory details of the Upside Down, the cold, the smell of decay, the sight of the floating spores, were seared into her memory. The threat was no longer an abstract idea or a blurry photograph. It was a real, physical entity that had to be hunted down and killed. This new idea, this new mission, gave her a terrifying clarity. She and Jonathan were no longer just looking for their lost loved ones. They were preparing for war. The formation of the new Nancy-Jonathan faction immediately sent shockwaves through the delicate social ecosystem of Hawkins High. The new order was one of grim purpose, a secret alliance of two teenagers who had seen a monster and were now determined to kill it. This new bond, forged in shared trauma and a desperate quest for justice, created a series of intense internal and external conflicts, most notably with Steve Harrington. Steve, who had been trying to mend his relationship with Nancy, couldn't understand her sudden shift. He saw her spending more and more time with Jonathan, the school's resident loner and freak. From his perspective, it looked like a betrayal. His insecurity and jealousy, stoked by his friends Tommy and Carol, began to curdle into a toxic anger. He saw Jonathan not as a partner in a terrifying mystery, but as a rival who was stealing his girlfriend. This conflict came to a head in a public and humiliating way. Steve and his friends saw Nancy and Jonathan together and jumped to the worst conclusion. Later that night, they cornered Jonathan and started a physical altercation, but the true damage was done with a can of spray paint. In the alley behind the local movie theater, they created a cruel piece of graffiti, calling Nancy a slut and shaming her for her supposed infidelity. The message was a brutal public shaming, a way for Steve to reclaim his social dominance and punish Nancy for her perceived transgression. When Nancy and Jonathan discovered the graffiti, the emotional fallout was immense. Nancy was devastated, and Jonathan, fiercely protective of her, was enraged. This led to a violent confrontation between Jonathan and Steve at school. Jonathan pushed past his breaking point, unleashed years of pent-up rage, beating Steve to a bloody pulp before being arrested. The fight was a physical manifestation of the class and social tensions that had always simmered beneath the surface of Hawkins, now brought to a boil by the supernatural chaos. While this new faction was causing drama in the teenage world, the original party of the boys was experiencing its own painful schism. Lucas, ever the pragmatist, had become completely convinced that 11 was a liability, if not an outright traitor. His suspicion was not unfounded. He had noticed that every time they got close to finding Will, 11 seemed to subconsciously lead them away, towards the lab. He theorized that she was a pawn of the bad men, a psychic homing beacon leading them straight to her masters. He saw her not as a friend, but as a monster herself, a tool of the enemy. This created an irreconcilable rift between him and Mike. Mike, whose feelings for 11 were deepening into a powerful first crush, defended her with a passionate, almost blind faith. He saw her as their only hope, a superhero who was just as scared as they were. The argument that finally broke them apart was heated and personal. Lucas accused Mike of being blinded by his feelings for a weirdo, and Mike accused Lucas of betraying the party. Unable to reconcile their views, Lucas made a decision. He would find the gate to the Upside Down himself, on his own terms, without the help of the girl he couldn't trust. He set off on his own, using his compass and a military-grade knowledge of navigation, a solitary ranger on a lonely quest. The party, the core fellowship of the story, was officially broken. This fracturing of the alliances was a critical moment. The heroes were divided, fighting amongst themselves, while the true enemy, Brenner and his forces, were closing in. The new order created by Nancy and Jonathan had led to violence and public shame, and the internal conflicts within the boys' party had left them vulnerable and alone. The chemistry that had made them strong was disrupted, and it was a weakness the monster and its creators were perfectly positioned to exploit. The emotional heart of Hawkins was shattered with the discovery of a body. In the cold, murky waters of Sattler's Quarry, state police divers pulled the small, lifeless form of what appeared to be Will Byers. The news spread through the town like a virus, a confirmation of every parent's worst fear. This was a critical turning point, a catastrophic event that seemed to bring the entire mystery to a tragic but definitive close. For the public, for the majority of the characters, this was the end of the story. Will Byers was dead. The case was closed. It was a moment of collective, crushing grief. Mike, Lucas, and Dustin were devastated. Their quest, their hope, all of it seemed to have been for nothing. Mike, in a fit of rage and grief, lashed out at 11, blaming her. "You were supposed to help us find him alive," he screamed, his words a dagger to the girl who had only ever tried to protect him. This was the lowest point for the party, their fellowship already broken by Lucas's departure, now shattered by what seemed to be the final, brutal truth. The discovery of the body was a masterstroke by the villain, Dr. Brenner. It was a perfectly executed trap, a piece of psychological warfare designed to end the search, to quell the town's panic, and to make everyone, especially the pesky chief of police, go away. They had manufactured a hyper-realistic dummy, a decoy so convincing it fooled everyone. It was a tactical move to regain control of the narrative, to bury their secrets under a wave of communal grief. But it didn't fool everyone. Joyce Byers, upon seeing the body, refused to accept it. Her maternal instinct, the same force that had allowed her to communicate with her son through a wall of Christmas lights, screamed at her that the thing in the morgue was not her boy. Her refusal was seen by many as a tragic denial, a mother unable to accept the terrible truth. But for Jim Hopper, it was a red flag. His own suspicions about the quarry, about the neatness of it all, were amplified by Joyce's certainty. He had been a cop for too long. He knew that things were rarely this simple, this clean. The true turning point, the moment of shocking revelation, came in the cold, sterile silence of the Hawkins morgue. Hopper, driven by a gut feeling he couldn't ignore, went to see the body for himself. He confronted the state trooper guarding the door, a man whose authority felt hollow, staged. In a moment of decisive action that marked the full return of the big city detective, Hopper knocked the trooper out, locked the door, and approached the small form on the gurney. He pulled out his knife. It was a grotesque, desperate act. He sliced into the body's side, and the truth spilled out. Not blood, not organs, but a cascade of white, synthetic cotton stuffing. It was a fake. The rage that filled Hopper in that moment was a pure, clarifying fire. They had done this. They had created a fake child, subjected a grieving mother to the horror of identifying her own son's corpse, all to cover their tracks. This was no longer just a conspiracy. It was an act of monstrous, calculated cruelty. This discovery was the ultimate catalyst for Hopper. It burned away the last vestiges of his skepticism. He drove to the buyer's house, his truck a cloud of dust and righteous fury, and found Joyce huddled in her home on the verge of taking an axe to the wall to find her son. He stopped her, his voice low and urgent. "You were right," he said. "All of it. You were right." It was an apology, an admission of his own blindness, and a declaration of a new, unbreakable alliance. The catastrophic event of the body's discovery had failed as a tool of deception and had instead become the very thing that solidified the opposition against the lab. It transformed Hopper from a reluctant investigator into a warrior, and it proved to Joyce that she was not crazy. The villain's trap had backfired, and in doing so, had created the one thing they couldn't control: two broken, grieving adults, now united by a terrible truth and an even more terrible resolve. The discovery of the fake body was the final death of the old Jim Hopper. The cynical, apathetic, hungover police chief who had retreated to Hawkins to die was now gone, burned away in a fire of righteous fury. This was his great transformation, a fall from the grace of ignorance into the harsh, clarifying light of a monstrous truth. In his place rose the man he had been before, the sharp, relentless detective. But this time, he was fueled by a purpose that was even more powerful than his old sense of duty. He was now fighting for someone else's child, a chance to atone for the daughter he couldn't save. His internal monologue shifted from one of weary resignation to one of cold, focused rage. He now knew with absolute certainty that he was up against an enemy of immense power and unimaginable cruelty, an enemy that would stage the death of a child to protect its secrets. This knowledge didn't frighten him, it simplified everything. The world was no longer a gray area of petty crimes and moral ambiguities. It was now starkly black and white. There were monsters, and there were those who fought them. He had chosen his side. His first act as this new man was to go to Joyce and validate her, to tell her she wasn't crazy. This was a profound act of humility and alliance building. His next act was one of pure, paranoid, and ultimately correct tactical thinking. He went back to his own trailer, his sanctuary of misery, and saw it now as compromised territory. He knew they would be listening. With a methodical fury, he tore the place apart. He ripped up floorboards, pulled out light fixtures, sliced open his couch cushions, his hands moving with the frantic energy of a man possessed. And he found it. A sophisticated listening device. A bug hidden in a ceiling lamp. They had been in his home. The violation was absolute, a final confirmation that he was not paranoid. He was a target. This discovery solidified his new worldview. He was at war. He gathered Joyce and the newly reconciled party of boys, Mike, Dustin, and a returning remorseful Lucas, and brought them all to a neutral location. He was forming a resistance cell, a small army of misfits against a shadowy government force. He was no longer just a cop. He was a commander. The external pressures were immense. He was a small-town chief going up against a clandestine agency with limitless resources and a complete lack of morality. But this pressure didn't break him. It forged him into something harder, sharper. He made the final choice to abandon all pretense of working within the system. He knew he couldn't trust the state police, the government, anyone. His faction was this small group of traumatized, terrified, but determined people. His transformation was complete when he decided to go back into the lion's den. He and Joyce, now a united front, made a deal with Dr. Brenner. It was a devil's bargain. They would tell Brenner where 11 was, and in exchange, Brenner would let them go through the gate to rescue Will. It was a move of incredible bravery and desperation. He was willingly walking back into the hands of the enemy, sacrificing his own freedom for a chance to save Joyce's son. The fall of the apathetic Hopper was the rise of Hopper the hero, a man who had stared into the abyss of his own grief and had come out the other side, not healed, but armed with a purpose so powerful it made him fearless. He was ready to walk through a door to another dimension to save a child. A final, definitive act of redemption for the father who couldn't save his own. The narrative of Season 1 is defined by two primary antagonists, one monstrous and one human, whose actions become increasingly intertwined. The first, the Demogorgon, is the physical embodiment of the threat. It is a creature of pure, predatory instinct, a hunter from a dimension of death and decay. Its introduction into the story is through violence and fear, the abduction of Will, the killing of the scientists at the lab, the taking of Barb. It is the monster under the bed, the creature in the woods, a classic horror trope made terrifyingly real. It operates on a simple, primal level. It is drawn to blood. This makes it a predictable, if still terrifying, force of nature. It is the soldier on the front lines of this invasion, the immediate, tangible threat that the heroes must face. But the true villain, the architect of the entire crisis, is the human antagonist, Dr. Martin Brenner. He is a far more insidious and complex threat. Where the Demogorgon is a creature of instinct, Brenner is a creature of intellect and ambition. His evil is not overt. It is cloaked in the guise of scientific progress and national security. He is the man who opened the door, who played God and unleashed a demon on the world, all in the name of winning the Cold War. His introduction is one of quiet, menacing authority. He is Papa, a soft-spoken father figure who is, in reality, a master manipulator and a torturer. He sees his psychic children, especially 11, not as human beings, but as assets, tools to be sharpened and wielded. His skills are not claws and teeth, but surveillance, deception, and a complete lack of moral restraint. He is the head of a vast, powerful organization that can fake a child's death, tap every phone in town, and eliminate anyone who gets in their way with cold, clinical efficiency. The story alters as these two antagonists begin to work in a terrifying, albeit unintentional tandem. The Demogorgon's bloody work serves Brenner's purposes by creating chaos and fear, allowing his organization to operate under the cover of a town-wide panic. Brenner's hunt for 11, his escaped weapon, inadvertently drives her into the arms of the very children who are trying to solve the mystery of the monster he unleashed. The two threads of the story, the monster hunt and the government conspiracy, begin to merge. The heroes realize they are not just fighting a monster, they are fighting the people who let it out. This becomes clear to Hopper when he breaks into the lab and sees the gate for himself, a pulsating, organic wound in reality. He sees the full scale of Brenner's sin. It becomes clear to Nancy and Jonathan when they realize their fight is not just with the creature, but with the shadowy forces that deny its existence. The trajectory of the story shifts from a simple find the missing boy plot to a two-front war. The heroes must simultaneously evade the human villains who are hunting them and hunt the inhuman villain who is hunting everyone else. Brenner becomes the clear antagonist when he captures and interrogates Hopper and Joyce, revealing the depths of his obsession and his complete disregard for the lives he has ruined. He doesn't see the Demogorgon as a mistake. He sees it as a fascinating new discovery. The introduction of these two antagonists, the beast and its maker, elevates the story from a simple monster movie to a complex thriller about the true nature of monstrosity, the unthinking predator versus the thinking, calculating man who is, in many ways, far more terrifying. The second major conflict was a convergence of all the story's threads, an escalation that brought the different factions of heroes together against their common enemies. The conflict was sparked by a single, desperate plan to use Eleven's powers to find Will and Barb in the Upside Down. To do this, they needed to create a sensory deprivation tank, a way to amplify her abilities. The school's science teacher, Mr. Clark, in a moment of pure, innocent scientific enthusiasm, provided the instructions, completely unaware that he was helping a group of children build a gateway to another dimension in the middle school gymnasium. The team worked together, a small, determined resistance cell. Hopper and Joyce provided the resources, stealing a massive amount of salt from the school's stores. The kids, Mike, Lucas, and Dustin, their friendship now mended by the shared trauma and a heartfelt apology from Lucas, provided the technical support and the moral encouragement for 11. The scene of them building the makeshift tank, filling a kiddie pool with water and hundreds of pounds of salt, was a testament to their shared resolve. This was their final, desperate gambit. As 11, wearing blacked-out goggles, submerged herself in the water, she entered the void. There, in the black, watery expanse of her mind, she found them. She found Barbara Holland's body, a grotesque, decaying form, in the Upside Down's version of Steve's pool, a slug-like creature crawling out of her mouth. It was a horrifying confirmation of Nancy's worst fears. Barb was gone. Then, 11 found Will. He was alive, but barely, huddled and weak in the Upside Down's version of his backyard fort, Castle Byers. He was singing to himself, trying to stay brave in the dark. She was able to tell him, through the psychic ether, that his mother was coming for him. It was a moment of profound hope, but it came at a great cost. The massive psychic energy 11 expended to make this contact acted as a massive flare, a beacon that the bad men at the lab could not miss. The conflict erupted. Brenner's forces descended on the school, swarming the hallways, their goal to retrieve their asset. The heroes were split. Hopper and Joyce, armed with the knowledge of Will's location, made a desperate deal with Brenner. They would give him 11 in exchange for access to the gate to save Will. It was a devil's bargain, a betrayal born of a parent's love. Meanwhile, the kids were trying to escape the school with 11. This led to a thrilling chase through the hallways and out into the schoolyard, culminating in one of the season's most iconic moments. As a van full of armed agents bore down on them, threatening to run them over, 11, with a final furious scream, used her telekinesis to flip the entire van over their heads. It was a stunning display of power, a moment that proved she was not a victim, but a warrior. The escalated stakes were now clear. The lab was willing to use lethal force against children to get what they wanted. The heroes, for their part, had to adapt. They were no longer just hiding. They were actively fighting back. The reconciliation between Mike and Lucas was solidified in this moment of shared danger, their earlier squabbles seeming petty in the face of death. This second major conflict was the point of no return. The secret war had spilled out into the open, and it was clear that it could only end in a final, bloody confrontation. The most devastating loss of the season, the one that lingered as a symbol of the true, random cruelty of the events, was the death of Barbara Holland. Her disappearance was the catalyst for Nancy's transformation, but her confirmed death was a moment of profound, quiet tragedy that underscored the real stakes of their fight. Barb was the embodiment of innocent collateral damage. She was not a fighter, not a hero, not a part of the central mystery. She was just a good friend, a sensible, slightly cynical girl who was in the wrong place at the absolute wrong time. She was dragged into the nightmare not because of any action of her own, but because of her loyalty to Nancy. The narrative of her loss was built on a foundation of guilt and regret. Nancy, caught up in the intoxicating world of Steve Harrington and teenage popularity, had pushed Barb aside. She had insisted Barb come to the party and then had abandoned her to go upstairs with Steve. Barb was left alone by the pool, a lonely figure in her oversized glasses and mom jeans, nursing a cut on her hand. It was the scent of her blood, a single drop falling into the water, that drew the Demogorgon. Her death was not shown in a blaze of glory. It was a quiet, terrifying, and unseen event. She was simply pulled into the upside down, her fate a mystery that haunted Nancy for days. The tension around her fate built slowly. Her parents filed a missing person report. Her car was found, but the town, consumed by the more dramatic disappearance of Will Byers, treated her case as a secondary concern. She was likely just another teenage runaway. For Nancy, however, the guilt was a constant driving force. Every step she took in her investigation, every risk she took with Jonathan, was fueled by the desperate hope of finding her friend alive. The final confirmation of her death, delivered through 11's psychic journey in the makeshift sensory deprivation tank, was a moment of quiet horror. 11, in the void, found Barb's body. It was a grotesque, decaying corpse in the slimy, empty pool of the upside down, a slug-like creature crawling from her mouth. It was a definitive, undignified end for a character who deserved so much better. The emotional weight of this confirmation fell squarely on Nancy. Her hope was extinguished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. Her friend was dead, and it was her fault. This moment was a devastating loss that transformed Nancy's quest from one of rescue to one of pure vengeance. She was no longer just trying to solve a mystery. She was now determined to hunt down and kill the thing that had murdered her best friend. Barb's death served a crucial narrative purpose. It demonstrated that no one was safe. It showed that the monster was not selective, that its violence could touch anyone. It grounded the supernatural horror in a very real, very painful human loss, giving the final conflict a sharp, personal edge of grief and revenge. The psychological and emotional fallout from the chaotic events at the school and the confirmation of Barb's death was a period of grim, focused resolve. The various factions of heroes, now united by a common purpose and a shared terrible knowledge, regrouped at the Byers' house. The atmosphere was thick with a mixture of grief, fear, and a desperate, fragile hope. The house itself, once a symbol of Joyce's supposed madness with its string-light alphabet, was now their fortress, their command center for the final battle. The morale of the group was low, but their determination was absolute. Nancy was grappling with the fresh grief of Barb's death, her sorrow hardening into a cold, steely anger. She was no longer a scared teenager. She was a soldier preparing for war. Jonathan, standing by her side, found a new strength in his role as her partner and protector. Even Steve Harrington, drawn back into the chaos by his lingering feelings for Nancy and a dawning sense of conscience, was beginning to transform from a clueless jock into a reluctant but courageous ally. For the kids, the near-death experience of the van flip had bonded them in a way nothing else could. The fracture between Mike and Lucas was completely healed, their friendship reinforced by the shared trauma. They now looked at Eleven not just as a friend or a weapon, but as their leader, their queen. Their strategy shifted from one of discovery to one of direct confrontation. They knew where Will was, and they knew what they had to do to get him back. The emotional fallout for Hopper and Joyce was one of grim partnership. They had made a deal with the devil, Dr. Brenner, betraying Eleven's location in exchange for access to the gate. It was a morally compromising choice, but one they made as parents, a sacrifice they were willing to make to save Will. Their relationship was now one of soldiers in a trench, their shared mission eclipsing any personal feelings. They were a unit focused on the impossible task ahead, walking into another dimension to rescue a child from a monster. The preparation for the end was a multi-pronged assault, a plan with several moving, interdependent parts. The team split up to fight the war on different fronts. First, Nancy and Jonathan, fueled by their newfound resolve, went to a surplus store. They were no longer children waiting to be rescued. They were hunters. They bought a bear trap, gasoline, a revolver, and nails to create a spiked baseball bat. Their plan was to turn the Byers' house into a death trap for the Demogorgon. They would lure it in, wound it, and burn it. It was a desperate, almost suicidal plan, born of teenage bravado and grief-fueled rage. Back at the school, Hopper and Joyce prepared for their journey into the Upside Down. They donned hazmat suits, their faces grim, as they were led by Brenner's men to the gate in the lab's sub-basement. It was a descent into hell, a journey into a world no human was meant to see. Their rally cry was a silent, shared look of determination. They were going into the dark to bring back the light. The kids, meanwhile, were left at the school, supposedly under the protection of Brenner's men. But their role was far from over. They were the keepers of 11, the guardians of the one person who had the power To end this all, the stage was set for a final, epic confrontation. The troops were rallied, the plans were in motion, and the fate of Hawkins rested on the shoulders of a small, determined band of broken people, brave children, and one very powerful little girl. The final confrontation of the Hawkins nightmare was a symphony of interwoven chaos, a battle fought on 3 fronts simultaneously, each action echoing across the dimensions. The first front was in the Upside Down. Hopper and Joyce, clad in bulky hazmat suits, stepped through the grotesque pulsating gate into a world of living decay. The air was thick with toxic spores, the landscape a monochromatic hellscape of twisted, vine-covered versions of their own town. They moved through the eerie silence, their flashlights cutting through the perpetual gloom, following the faint, ghostly sound of a child singing. Their journey led them to the Upside Down's version of the Byers house, and then to Castle Byers, Will's backyard fort. There, they found him, unconscious. A grotesque, vine-like tendril snaked down his throat, a living umbilical cord connecting him to the hive mind of this dying world. Hopper, with a father's desperate fury, tore the tendril from Will's mouth, while Joyce, a lioness fighting for her cub, began CPR, breathing life back into her son's body, her every breath a prayer against the encroaching darkness. The second front was at the Byers house in the real world. Nancy and Jonathan, having set their trap, intentionally cut their hands, using the scent of their own blood as bait. The Demogorgon, its senses drawn by the fresh blood, smashed through the wall. The fight was a frantic, desperate struggle for survival. They managed to lure the monster into the bear trap, but it was too strong, pulling itself free. They lit it on fire, but still, it would not die. Just as it cornered them, Steve Harrington, in a moment of stunning, redemptive bravery, burst in, wielding the nail-studded baseball bat. He had come back for Nancy. He joined the fight, his jock bravado transformed into genuine courage, landing blow after blow on the monster, driving it back into the trap. The third and most explosive front was at Hawkins Middle School. The kids, left behind, found themselves in a new kind of danger. Dr. Brenner and his forces arrived, not to protect them, but to take 11. But the massive amount of blood shed during the earlier fight between the agents and 11 had acted as a massive beacon. The Demogorgon, having escaped the trap at the Byers house, was drawn to the school. It smashed through the walls, a creature of pure, relentless fury, and began to slaughter Brenner's agents. Brenner himself was seemingly killed, attacked by the very monster he had studied and inadvertently unleashed. The kids were cornered in a classroom, the Demogorgon breaking down the door, its faceless head unfurling to reveal its endless teeth. Lucas, with his wrist rocket, fired a barrage of stones, a brave but futile act of defiance. The creature swatted him aside. It was over. But then 11 stepped forward. The girl who had been so afraid, so controlled, now stood as their final line of defense. She pinned the monster to the blackboard with her mind, the sheer force of her power causing the building to shake, the lights to explode. The strain on her was immense, blood pouring from her nose. She looked back at her friends, at Mike, with a look of sad, resolute love. "Goodbye, Mike," she whispered, a final heartbreaking farewell. Then she turned back to the monster, raised her hand, and let out a final, silent scream of pure, annihilating power. A wave of energy erupted from her, enveloping the Demogorgon, tearing it apart atom by atom until it dissolved into a cloud of black ash. And in the sudden, ringing silence that followed, 11 too was gone. She had sacrificed herself to save her friends, her final act, one of supreme love and power. The immediate aftermath of the final confrontation was a landscape of quiet, exhausted relief and profound, soul-crushing grief. In the upside down, Hopper and Joyce's desperate efforts paid off. Will Byers gasped, coughed, and his eyes fluttered open. They had done it. They had walked into hell and brought him back. Back in the real world, the boys stood in the empty classroom, surrounded by the dissipating black ash that was all that remained of the Demogorgon. But the victory felt hollow. 11 was gone. Mike called her name, his voice small and broken in the sudden, deafening silence. Their savior, their friend, their superhero had vanished. The resolution was a tapestry woven from threads of joy and sorrow. The story moved to Hawkins General Hospital, where the separate factions were finally, truly united. Will was recovering, pale and weak, but alive. The reunion of the Byers family was a moment of pure, cathartic relief. Joyce held her son, her frantic, year-long nightmare finally over. Jonathan stood by, his quiet strength a comforting presence. The party was also reunited with their lost friend. Mike, Lucas, and Dustin gathered around Will's hospital bed, their fellowship whole once more, but with a new, permanent void in the shape of the girl who had made it all possible. Hopper, watching from the doorway, allowed himself a small, weary smile. He had kept his promise. He had saved Joyce's boy, but his relief was short-lived. He was met in the hospital lobby by two men in black suits. Without a word, he followed them, getting into a black, unmarked car. The implication was clear. His deal with the devil was not over. He had saved Will, but he now belonged to them. His freedom, the price of his heroism. He was now part of the cover-up, a man on the inside, forever tied to the secrets of the lab. The immediate aftermath for the town of Hawkins was a return to a fragile, manufactured normalcy. The official story was a tapestry of lies, blaming the week's strange events on a combination of a tragic drowning, a bad electrical grid, and a chemical spill from the lab. The true story, the story of monsters and other dimensions, was buried, a secret shared by only a handful of survivors. The victory was real. Will was home. The monster was dead. The immediate threat was neutralized. But it was a victory that came at a staggering cost. The primary loss was 11, a ghost who had saved them all and then disappeared without a trace. Her absence was a palpable grief, especially for Mike, who kept the blanket fort in his basement, a shrine to the girl he had loved and lost. The resolution was not a clean ending, but a messy, complicated piece, a quiet acknowledgement that things would never truly go back to the way they were. They had seen the other side, and that knowledge had changed them all forever. The victory over the Demogorgon was real, but it was a Pyrrhic one, and the true cost began to unravel in the quiet days and weeks that followed. While the town of Hawkins settled back into its comfortable routine, willfully ignorant of the horrors that had transpired, The heroes were left to grapple with the emotional and psychological shrapnel of the battle. The primary cost was the loss of 11. For the boys, especially Mike, her absence was a constant, aching void. The empty space in their party was more than just a missing friend. It was a missing piece of their own courage, their own sense of wonder. Mike would sit in the basement fort he had built for her, a sanctuary that now felt like a tomb, a silent testament to the girl who had shown him real magic and then vanished. The personal losses were profound. Nancy Wheeler had to live with the knowledge of Barb's death, a secret grief she couldn't share with anyone but Jonathan. Her relationship with Steve, patched back together in the aftermath, was forever changed. They were two people trying to pretend they were the same kids they had been before, but they were haunted by a shared, unspoken trauma. Steve had seen a monster, and Nancy had walked in its world. There was no going back to simple make-out sessions and high school parties. The cost for Hopper was his freedom and his integrity. Getting into that black car was an act of capitulation. He was now part of the system he had fought against, a compromised man forced to help maintain the lie, to protect the people he cared about. He was seen, in a later scene, leaving a box in the woods with Eggo waffles inside, a quiet, hopeful offering to a ghost, a sign that his fight and his role as her protector was far from over. The wider environmental and political consequences were all happening behind the scenes. Hawkins' lab was still operational, though now under a new, more discreet management. The gate to the Upside Down, though seemingly dormant after the Demogorgon's death, was still there, a festering wound deep beneath the lab, a permanent scar on their reality. The cover-up was extensive and absolute, a chilling display of the government's power to rewrite history. The true cost, ultimately, was the loss of innocence. None of them could ever go back to being the people they were before. The boys could no longer play Dungeons and Dragons without seeing the shadow of a real monster. Nancy could no longer see the world as a safe, predictable place. And Joyce, though she had her son back, would forever be the woman who had heard a monster in her walls. Unraveling the true cost reveals that they hadn't just defeated a monster. They had become keepers of a terrible secret, soldiers in a war that no one else knew was being fought. Their victory was not an ending, but an induction into a new, more dangerous world where the lines between reality and nightmare were permanently blurred. 1 month later, Hawkins was draped in the festive glow of Christmas, a town desperately trying to force a sense of normalcy over the fresh scars of its recent trauma. The long-term legacy of the battle was a new, fragile status quo, a world where the heroes were reunited, but forever changed. The Byers' house was filled with the warm, comforting chaos of a family dinner. Will was back at the table, seemingly healthy, laughing with his brother and his mother. But the impact of his time in the Upside Down was a ticking time bomb hidden beneath the surface. The final scene of the season reveals the true, terrifying legacy of his ordeal. He excused himself to the bathroom where he coughed, not into the sink, but into the toilet, a grotesque, slug-like creature writhing out of his throat. For a horrifying second, the bathroom around him flickered, transforming into the decaying, vine-covered hellscape of the Upside Down. The vision passed, but the message was clear. Will had brought a piece of the other world back with him. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a host, a living gate, the legacy of the monster now inside him. The lasting scars on the other characters were more subtle, but just as profound. The party was back together, gathered in Mike's basement for another D&D campaign. They were laughing, yelling, the familiar rhythm of their friendship restored. But when they defeat the campaign's monster, they cheer for a new hero in their game, a powerful princess, a clear homage to 11. Her chair at the table was empty, a permanent, silent tribute to the friend they had lost. Her legacy was her absence, a ghost that would forever haunt their fellowship. Nancy Wheeler's new status quo was a return to her old life with Steve, but with a newfound depth and a secret bond with Jonathan. She gave Jonathan a new camera for Christmas, a gift that was both an apology for Steve breaking his old one and a quiet acknowledgement of the unique connection they now shared. They were two soldiers who had seen the same war, and that shared experience would forever link them, regardless of their romantic entanglements. Hopper's legacy was his new, compromised role. He was seen leaving the police station Christmas party, a hero to the town for finding Will Byers, but he stopped to leave a box of food in the snowy woods, egos prominently placed on top. He was still protecting 11, still keeping her secret, his life now one of dual purpose, maintaining the lie for the town and keeping a light on for the one person who knew the whole truth. The world had permanently changed for this small group of people. They were now the guardians of a terrible secret, their lives forever defined by that 1 week in November. The impact of the events was not a clean resolution, but a messy, ongoing condition. They had won the battle, but the lasting scar was the knowledge that the war was not over. The upside down was not gone. It was just waiting. The gate was not closed. It was just quiet. And the monster was not dead. It had just planted its seeds in a new host. The story of that week in Hawkins was the story of a perfect, normal town having its mask ripped off. It was about the monsters that hide in plain sight, not just the ones from other dimensions, but the ones that lurk in secret government labs, in school hallways, and even in the quiet grief of a father's heart. It was a story that showed us that the truest weapons against the dark are not guns or psychic powers, but the fierce, almost illogical loyalty of a childhood friendship, the unyielding power of a mother's love, and the courage of ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances. They fought a monster, they closed a door, and they brought a lost boy home. But in the end, as Will Byers stands in front of his bathroom mirror, seeing not his own reflection, but the dying, spore-filled world of the Upside Down, we are left with a chilling final question. Can you ever truly come back from the dark, or do you just bring the darkness back with you?